Chelsea. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I'm wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and today I'm bringing you my final wrap-up for the month of October. Now, Goodreads is having a problem right now where it's not showing your read dates for a bunch of your books, at least for some people, and I'm one of those people. And that's how I usually tell what I read when for my wrap-ups. But I think I do know what I read in October and in what order. I think I read 9 books. I also participated in 2 readathons. So the first was the Cozyathon, which ran from the 1st through the 15th. And then I also sort of participated in the Spooky Shelfie, which was a month-long set of reading challenges. So the first book I finished in the month of October, I finished at the very, very beginning of the month, like on the first day, so this doesn't count for any of the readathons, but this is The Stone Sky by N.K. Jemisin. This is the 3rd book in the Broken Earth trilogy. The first 2, of course, being the 5th season and The Obelisk Gate. I think this was my favorite of the 3. I think for the first 2 books, I was sort of waiting for the explanation of like what is going on that was obviously delivered in this book. This series is basically like a far, 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 far future epic fantasy that re-examines ideas about post-apocalyptic fiction. At this point, we have 2 protagonists, a mother and a daughter, both of whom are powerful origins, the people in this world who have the magical power to control the earth, but are also incredibly oppressed. At the beginning of this series, these 2 characters were separated, and they've been far apart on this single continent of the Stillness ever since. This continent that has been literally physically broken down the middle by the rifting, causing the world to become increasingly uninhabitable. At this point, Essen is attached to this really unconventional community, this comm that has origin leadership, and a lot of Essen's personal story in this is about her relationship with that community. Nassun, on the other hand, has come into her own as a person and as a character under really extreme circumstances, and she has really hard choices to make about the fate of the entire world that hinge on her perception of family and humanity and all of that. But what I loved most about this book was finally getting chapters that take us back through the ages to the long-ago society of the obelisk builders. This is a society with a sort of solar punk aesthetic where life is ostensibly sacred, but what that actually ends up meaning in practice is that life is exploited. As we journey back in time like this, we also get a much clearer sense of the blend of fantasy and science fiction that N.K. Jemisin is using in this book. There are things about the obelisk builders' civilization that are extremely science fictional in how their technology works, and we can glimpse how this is maybe a far future of Earth as we know it, and yet magic is very clearly and essentially understood to be real. The magic here is a life force, and we get this question of what happens if the Earth itself is literally alive, which I think, in retrospect, threads through a lot of the series. Also in these chapters, we get a clearer picture of the character who is telling this story, and by the end of the book, we finally understand why this character is telling this story to the person he's telling this to. This series explores how systems of oppression perpetuate themselves, not just within comprehensible periods of time, but from one whole society or era of the world to the next, to the next, to the next. I gave this book 5 stars. Next is going to be the first book that I read for Cozyathon. This is the book that I read for the challenge of read a book entirely by candlelight. I think I spent 3 consecutive evenings reading by candlelight for as long as I could make that work to get through this book, so this took much longer to read than a novella otherwise would have for me, and that is Of Sorrow and Such by Angela Slatter. This is a fantasy novella from Tor.com about a character named Mistress Gideon who is a witch in a small community where she works as a healer and lives with her adoptive daughter who's an apprentice herbalist but doesn't have magical powers herself. Apparently this is a character who shows up in some of Angela Slater's other short fiction. You get a sense that this is one part of her life and that there are other parts of her life that might be worthy of stories told about them, but this stands on its own. I think there may be another character in this as well who shows up in something else that this author has written. Basically what happens in this book is that Mistress Gideon and another witch give assistance to a woman in this town who it turns out is a shapeshifter and has gotten in trouble. And then it enters this really sticky territory of who can be trusted with your secrets if you could burn at the stake for being a witch. And to what extent can you afford to help others, and to what extent does it have to be every woman for herself? The mother-daughter relationship is also really central in this. The daughter, Jilly, is going through, a normal, rebellious teen growing up phase of life, complete with "you're not my real mother and why won't you teach me magic?" But that actually gets really dangerous when the stakes are this high. The magic in this was sort of quiet and mysterious stuff that I really like. It's dark, it's about the oppression of women. The main character is a total survivor. I thought it was great and I gave it 4 stars. I'm looking forward to reading more from this author. I know there's at least one short story collection of hers that my library has that I really want to read. The next thing I read had not been on my TBR for October, so I wasn't reading it for any of the readathons. I could count it for the challenge of a book with an autumnal cover for the Cozyathon, but honestly this cover is even more autumnal, so I'm just gonna say that this wasn't for the readathon that was going on while I was reading it, sorry. But this is Psyche in a Dress by Francesca Leah Block. I got this from the library via Overdrive on my Kindle, and this is a very short book. This was a group read for the Goodreads group Into the Forest, which I'm a member of, which is why I read it. This is a very dark, contemporary Greek mythology retelling that's told primarily in poetry. And I had a hard time rating it because it is so short. I think in print it's only a little over 100 pages, which to me would be like a novella length. And then because it's poetry, it's like very short lines and a lot of blank space on the page. So to me, in terms of length, it read like a very, very densely written magical realism, like novelette, like longer short story. And I very rarely rate things that are that short. So the overall story here is a Cupid and Psyche retelling, but there are other myths within it as the main character goes through phases of her life where she becomes different women from Greek mythology. At the beginning, she's a teenager, she's the daughter of a filmmaker, and her first love is Eros, but then as she moves on in life, she meets men who are Narcissus, who are Orpheus, and who are Hades, and when she's in those relationships, she becomes Echo, Eurydice, Persephone. I think really what this book is trying to talk about in some ways is unhealthy relationships and abuse. And for me, the takeaway message was a lot about self-worth. Throughout these relationships, she feels like she's the mortal woman in love with a god. It's not until the end when she's a grown woman with a daughter of her own that she becomes a mother figure, that she becomes Demeter, a goddess, and when she sees herself as a goddess, that's when she can actually be in a relationship with someone that she once thought of as a god on equal terms. So this is published as YA, and there was some argument over in the discussion on this book that this is not YA because the content and because she's only a teenager for the beginning of the book. But I would play devil's advocate there and say that this is, for all of that, a book that is trying to talk to teenagers, to try to impart some hard-earned life experience about unhealthy relationships to younger readers before they go through that. But that's just how I read it. I did like the writing style. It's very magical realism-y, where some things get magical or mythical and you're not totally sure what's real and what's not. I also liked the sort of weird meta filmmaking stuff mixed with mythology. That particular blend reminded me of Radiance by Catherine M. Valenti, although this is obviously a really different sort of book. It was not fun to read because the subject matter was so dark, but it was really good to think on after finishing it, and I gave it 4 stars. The next thing I read was A Face Like Glass by Frances Hardinge. I got this from the library. I've given it back, but I have already done a full review of this book, so I will link it. It's a kind of crazy middle grade fantasy. I read it for the Cozyathon challenge of read a book that you've been craving for a long time. I was not let down. I gave this 5 stars. I've not read anything quite like it in terms of fantasy setting, in terms of particularly wacky imagination. I really liked it. So you can check out my full review for that. The next book that I read for Cozyathon was A Hatful of Sky by Terry Pratchett, which was for the challenge of reread an all-time favorite, the Tiffany Aching series, or childhood favorites of mine. I reread The We Free Men last year, and it was a 5-star read for me. This was not quite as good as The We Free Men, but it was still pretty dang spectacular. In this book, the young witch Tiffany Aching leaves her home in the chalk to go train to be a witch with a witch named Miss Level. So she's leaving home for the first time. She meets a group of other trainee witches, but it turns out that she's being pursued by a pretty terrifying thing called a hiver that wants to possess her mind. I think the hiver freaked me out a bit as a kid, not so much this time because I knew what was coming and I knew what was going to happen with it, and I knew that I liked what was coming and was going to happen with it. I'd say though about the first 2/3 of this book was more of a sort of predictable kids book narrative than I would say The We Free Men was. Tiffany is possessed by the hiver that makes her want to be all-powerful and makes her do some pretty terrible things, so there's some very on-the-nose messaging about why that's wrong and why real witches don't do that and what it really means to be a witch. But then, like the final third of the book, at about the 2/3 mark, there's the point where I would think in any other normal kids book it would kind of be the end. And that's the point when it gets unpredictable, and I think when Pratchett gets unpredictable is when he gets, like, total genius amazing. Granny Weatherwax becomes involved. The scenes with Tiffany and Granny Weatherwax together make me really happy because these are my 2 favorite Discworld characters on the page together in one book. And I think the ending of this book is just really insanely good. So I gave this 4 stars. Hopefully it won't be too long until I continue on further with my Tiffany Aching reread. Oh, I think I got the order of a couple books wrong here. I think before I read A Hatful of Sky, I read Dragonbreath, Curse of the Were-wiener by Ursula Vernon. This is the 3rd book in her Dragonbreath series for kids. They're very short. They're like half graphic novel, half regular text. I think this is my favorite of the Dragonbreath series so far, which surprised me because, like, Were-wiener paranormal hot dogs, it's strange, but I wasn't expecting it to tickle my funny bone. It totally tickled my funny bone. This book was hilarious. This was a book that just sort of revels in its own bizarreness, and I liked that a lot. In this installment of the Dragonbreath series, Danny Dragonbreath's friend Wendell, the iguana, gets bitten in the school cafeteria by a hot dog. Consequently, Wendell will turn into a were-hot dog in 3 days' time unless Danny and Wendell can defeat the Alpha Worst. In order to do this, they must enlist the aid of the all-powerful potato salad from book 1. Like, no one could have written this except Ursula Vernon, I'm pretty sure. These books are pretty reliable 3 stars for me. I have fun with them, but I'm just not the target audience because I am not a kid and they're very specifically kids' books. I've been giving them to my cousin, who is a kid. So this was the book that when I finished reading it, I sent to my cousin as a Halloween gift for the Cozyathon challenge of give a comforting book to someone who's going through a rough time. I'm not totally sure how well this qualifies as a comforting book, but it's funny, and funny is comforting, right? The next book I read was Soulless by Gail Carriger, which I picked up for the Cozy-a-thon challenge of read a book for pure escapism. Because I am a Fantasy of Manners fan, it is completely inexplicable that I hadn't yet picked this up. Like, it was an embarrassment. Because this book has so much hype, though, I think my expectations may have been a bit too high. I did enjoy it. I should note that I did not finish this until the day after the Cozy-a-thon ended. So I didn't really complete the challenge, but I did read the book. This is alternate Victorian history steampunk paranormal romance. Gail Carriger is an author with a sort of lighthearted style that I think is a really good fit for me as a reader. But this ended up being more heavily werewolf romance and less steampunk Fantasy of Manners than I would have personally hoped for. And it was still like total cotton candy to eat, and I have no regrets, and I will read the next book. But it wasn't as spot on for me personally as this combination of elements could have been. Alexia Taraboti's family has marked her for spinsterhood because she is not a flighty ingenue. Little do they know she is also preternatural, the opposite of supernatural, a soulless person whose touch counteracts the abilities of vampires and werewolves. In this alternate world, vampires and werewolves have established places in high society in England, and this is mostly a steamy romance between Alexia and Lord Macon, who is the alpha of a werewolf pack in London, and that status gives him the title of a lord, even though he doesn't necessarily hail from the nobility. The main plot of this is ostensibly about a sort of mystery of vampires and werewolves going missing, as well as some vampires showing up with no idea of like how to be vampires and committing terrible social faux pas. There's some great mad scheme behind this. Lord Macon and Alexia investigate, but mostly it feels like the plot is an excuse to throw these two characters together in situations where they cannot keep their hands off of each other in more and more bizarre circumstances. So yes, this was a very fast, easy read. I was hoping for more of the steampunk in the world building. I get the sense that there is some steampunk technology in this alternate world, but we didn't really get a chance to see much of that. I get the sense there's also a lot of political stuff that could be explored way more in the rest of the series, so there's definitely potential here for the series to do a lot of interesting things in this world, and given that I know that she's written a lot of books in this world at this point, I'm looking forward to see the angle that some of those take. The next book I read was a NetGalley arc, and this one was Under the Pendulums Sun by Jeannette. This is a Gothic historical Fae fantasy in which Victorian missionaries go to the Fae lands to convert the Fae. The protagonist is Catherine Helstone, the sister of a missionary who has stopped communicating with her. She is going to Arcadia, the fairyland, in order to find him and help him. She ends up basically confined in this creepy castle. I've done a full review of this. It was in a double review video, so I will link that for you. It's a very thought-driven book with a lot of really intense theology. It's also the creepiest thing that I read in October. I gave it 4 stars. Do check out my review. And then the last thing that I finished reading in October was Steeplejack by A.J. Hartley. This is the first in a YA fantasy series called the Alternative Detective series, I think, that takes place in a setting that's supposed to be inspired by 19th century South Africa. The only really fantastical, magical element in this story is the existence of a mineral called luxorite that ends up being important to this story. It's a mineral of great value because it is literally a shining light source. Otherwise, this is a non-magical world. I've seen this described as steampunk. I would not call it steampunk. Yes, it is 19th century and there is steam technology, but it isn't advanced or speculative technology. It's all realistic for that time period. This follows a girl named Anglet or Anglet. Because her nickname is A-N-G, I say that Ang in my head. so I'm kind of calling her Anglet. But Ang is a steeplejack, so she does maintenance on these tall industrial chimneys in the city of Barcelem. The Barcelem is a city that is dominated by the white colonizers. The Mahweni are the native people, but Ang is Lani, which is another minority group that were brought there by the white colonizers. They're maybe supposed to be Indian, ? I'm not totally sure. Anyhow, Ang comes from a really dilapidated Lani area outside the main city, but she now lives and works in the city itself and has become sort of separated from that culture. At the beginning of the book, she both loses her job and agrees to take responsibility for her sister's newborn baby, which is a fourth girl, and in their culture they aren't allowed to have more than 3 girls in a family. The baby sort of ends up being this weird tangent in the story, though. One of the other things that happens at the beginning of the book is that her new apprentice appears to have fallen to his death, but she thinks that it's a murder. It turns out that a member of the opposition party ends up hiring her to investigate the circumstances around this murder, which end up being also connected to a whole lot of other things, including the theft of the beacon, which is a major luxorite stone that sits atop a tower and is a landmark in Barcelem. So this is the classic sort of thing where the unlikely protagonist ends up being privy to things that are happening throughout all walks of society in a city in strife. Racial tensions are rampant and she has to solve this mystery. It didn't make a ton of sense to me that she was hired to solve this mystery in the first place, and then her employer gets super angry with her like a couple times when she doesn't know how to like be an absolutely professional private investigator, which is like, you hired this random 17-year-old with climbing skills, why would you expect that? But of course she does end up being really good at it or the book wouldn't work. So the main hindrance to my enjoyment of this book was mostly that I kept comparing it with Six of Crows in my mind. Six of Crows being a sort of caper heist story, overlaid on a fantasy setting, and this being a mystery detective story overlaid over a fantasy setting. There are some parallels in terms of the application of that genre blend. Both of them center around cities with shady economic stuff going on, that are centers of trade, multicultural cities with racial conflict. And then Ang is a lot like Inej in that she's a teenage girl from an ethnic minority who like climbs rooftops and does badass things. But she's kind of lacking in all of the sort of lovable personality traits that make us love a character like Inej. This is a much flatter book to me in a lot of ways, so it suffered in comparison, even though I didn't really have any problems with this book. Interestingly, if we're doing a compare and contrast, something like Six of Crows is almost too angsty for me. Like over-the-top romance, angst, crazy backstories. This is sort of the opposite. We don't get any of that, but we also don't get the really wonderful character banter that Leigh Bardugo is so good at. What I ended up saying on Goodreads was that this felt to me kind of like Six of Crows without the charisma. This is a series. There are 2 books out already. I think it's going to be a trilogy. I would not be averse to reading the sequels, but they might be the sort of books that I just never end up getting to, and I don't mind because too many books, too little time. So I'm just gonna run back over the challenges for these readathons and say what I did or didn't do. For the Cozyathon, read in a coffee shop, I did that. Read in a bathtub, I did that. I don't remember which books I used for those. Read an entire book by candlelight, yes, that was Of Sorrow and Such. Read while wearing fluffy socks and a cozy jumper, yes, I did that. 5, read while listening to relaxing music, I did that. For me, relaxing music usually ends up being some 3 hours of Zen calming thing on YouTube thing. There are a lot of those. They're calming for me. 6, read while sipping a comforting hot beverage of your choice. I do this all the time. I did this a lot over the Cozy-a-thon. I drink a lot of tea when I read. I also made myself some spiced cider with chai. I get like just a bottle of spiced cider from Trader Joe's. I don't make my own spiced cider, but I heat it up on the stove with chai tea bags and make cider, and I like that a lot. 7, read a chapter first thing in the morning. I did in fact do this. I don't remember doing it, but I know that I did because I checked it off my list. Read a book purely for escapism, so that would be Soulless, which I didn't finish until the day after it ended, so I came close but not quite. Read a book with the word chocolate in the title. I did not do this because I did not have space to add more things to my TBR, and I just knew I wasn't gonna try that. Read a book with an autumnal cover. That was also of Sorrow and Such. Reread an all-time favorite. That was A Hatful of Sky. Listen to an audiobook while baking. Now, I did do the audiobook challenges. I did not do them while listening to an audiobook. I ended up doing them while catching up on the Welcome to Night Vale podcast. I spent a good deal of October kind of binge listening the last year or so of Welcome to Night Vale. I kind of only end up wanting to listen to Night Vale in the fall most of the time. So I ended up listening to a lot of it at once, and now I'm almost caught up. So I did listen to something while I baked my pumpkin pie. I have a unique family pumpkin pie recipe where it gets kind of fluffy, and it layers. If you want my recipe, let me know and I'll send it to you. It's actually super easy and really hard to screw up. Do exercise for at least half an hour while listening to an audiobook. I did this. I came down with a cold, and then like on day 3 of the cold, I was like, I'm gonna just like jog and walk on a treadmill for half an hour here to tell my body that it's time to stop being sick. I beat that cold pretty thoroughly. I listened to Welcome to Night Vale while doing it. Treat yourself to a book you've been craving for a long time. That one was A Face Like Glass. And give a comforting book to someone who is going through a rough time. I said I already sent my copy of Curse of the Were-wiener to my cousin. So that's not quite 100% victory on all of the challenges, but at least it's partial victory on all of them, so that's pretty good. Less victory on the spooky shelfie, but I still hit enough of the challenges that I can definitely consider myself having participated. I did not read a book with a serial killer in it. I read several books that had multiple murders in them, but none of them were serial killer murders. 2, a book that involves a spell or a curse. I was counting Curse of the Were-wiener for this because curse in the title. It was not particularly referred to as a spell or a curse in the book, but I think I've definitely got that covered. I think Of Sorrow and Such contains magic that sort of vaguely falls under the witchcraft spell curse category. And while spells and curses are not generally how Terry Pratchett's witchcraft works, the witch that Tiffany studies under in this book, Miss Level, has a very academic interest in the study of old spells and curses. So I think between all these books, I've definitely got it covered. 3, a book with supernatural or paranormal elements. Definitely Soulless, also Curse of the Were-wiener. 4, a book with a freakish character. This is one where I wanted to tread carefully because you could interpret freakish character in some not so great ways. But I went with Curse of the Were-wiener for this too because that Were-wiener is pretty freakish. Also though, like the Alpha Worst is pretty insane. There are evil hot dogs with teeth in this book is what I'm trying to tell you. A book with a mask in the cover or in the title. This was A Face Like Glass. A book with black and or orange on the cover. That's A Face Like Glass again for black, or Of Sorrow and Such for orange. 7, read a book with something that terrifies you. I could come up with justifications for reasons that any number of things that I read in October have things in them that terrified me in some way. I didn't hit like one book that was like, oh my gosh, this thing is terrifying me though. so I'm not really counting that one as completed. But that is still 5 out of 7 challenges for the month, so I think that's a victory for me. Anyhow, let me know if you've read any of these books, what you thought of them. Let me know if you read anything particularly exciting in the month of October. Looking forward to seeing you in the comments. Anyhow, I hope you're having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.